It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the night, Alvaro Jaramillo. So Alvaro is an affiliated senior biologist with SFBBO. He has worked with us for a long time doing both science and education. He's done a lot of field work in addition to teaching those bird identification workshops. He is also the owner of Alvaro's Adventures, where he leads a lot of other workshops as well, and he also leads birding trips all around the world. So be sure to check out his website, alvarosadventures.com. Alvaro has a bachelor's in zoology and a master's in ecology and evolution from the University of Toronto. And he is truly an expert on birds of North America, but also of Chile. And he's contributed to numerous field guides and publications, including New World Blackbirds, which he's going to be talking about today. So Alvaro, thank you so much for being on to share your expertise with us. And I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Serena and Karina. It's always fun to talk to people associated with SFBBO because they were really the group that first, when I came to the US, kind of allowed me to get into the whole world of biology here as a Canadian transplant. So I always have the group as sort of, I feel like they've helped me out a lot, and they're helping out a lot of birds, conservation issues, and also new students that are coming along, young people who are moving through the ranks of biology. So that's always great. Always great to see all the younger people. So here we are, blackbirds. This is, for North Americans, you often have these ideas of the blackbirds are like the Grackles and the Brewer's blackbirds. You forget that there's all these colorful ones like the Orioles, and then you go down to tropical parts of the Americas, and there's even more fancy looking birds that are in this group. But I'm gonna first start with just giving you a little rundown of a couple of things. One is that I think, especially for people in the east of North America, one of the first birds they ever see and really kind of go, wow, look at that thing. I cannot believe I'm seeing this thing and it's not on a TV show about amazing wildlife, is the red-winged blackbird. They're active, they flare out these epaulets, these shoulder patches, they display their voice, they're kind of everywhere for a period of time. And then as you become an experienced birder and you kind of have seen a lot of stuff, you forget the red-winged blackbird. You kind of put it in the back of like, oh, that's just a common bird. It's not that special. But hopefully, I'll try to convince you that these birds are pretty special. And the one thing, there's this confusion about names, which is kind of a fun confusion because the real blackbird is a thrush in Europe, right? So this bird down here is the real blackbird, the European blackbird. People came, English-speaking people came to the New World, to the Americas, and then they said, aha, look at that thing, that's a blackbird. But it wasn't. It was an entirely different group of birds. This family is known as the Icteridae, and Icteridae means yellow birds. Actually, it applies to how yellow a lot of the Orioles were. This bird here on the right, it's an Oriole blackbird, and it has two names that are wrong because, okay, I just told you blackbirds aren't really blackbirds, but our Orioles, New World Orioles, are named for these yellow birds in Africa and Europe called Orioles over there that are a different family. So this bird is misnamed in two ways. And then if you want to get into it, what's really weird is it even applies in Spanish. So in Chile, you go and look at the Austral Blackbird and it's called the tordo. And the tordo is the Spanish name for the European blackbird. And then you probably have seen oropendolas. Oropendolas, which are in the Icteridae, that's a Spanish name for the Orioles. So, I mean, it's a mess of names, but there's a lot of kind of fun stuff going on in there and as part of names. And then you also think, okay, well, blackbirds just means anything that's black. No, it doesn't, you know, so starlings and crows, ravens, they can look black or be black like ravens and crows. The starling will look blacker as it you know, wears away all those points. These are different families again. So not all birds that are black are blackbirds. It's the family Icteridae, which are really the yellow birds. And it makes sense when you start seeing orioles and you start seeing things like this western meadowlark. But it's actually a pretty broad series of birds, including some things that are really different looking that are in the blackbird family. So I'm just going to say blackbird now from now on, and you know there's all this mess of names, and I'm really talking about the icterids. One thing that the icterids have that is shared with the starling, and you kind of see it with the bill type. So this is sternus is a starling, and a meadowlark is actually sternella, which means kind of starling-like because they have similar bills. Well, blackbirds and starlings have a way to open the bill against pressure. Most birds can close the bill with pressure, right, and crack seeds. Blackbirds and starlings can open the bill with force, and that allows them to probe and pick into the soil, open things up, which is really kind of a unique little trick. So one of the reasons I'm talking to you about blackbirds is because I'm a super fan of blackbirds, and I wrote this book ages ago. In fact, I dropped out of my PhD program and instead wrote this book. It's nice. There's a whole story behind that, but in the end, I spent a lot of time on this book because I was so enthralled with blackbirds. And the moment I was doing all this research on blackbirds while my PhD was supposed to be on something completely different was when I realized I wasn't, you know, cut out to be doing that project. And I devoted myself to these cool birds like this long-tailed meadowlark. I was asked earlier if I'd given this talk recently. I haven't given this talk recently, but it reminds me that the first time I was supposed to give this talk was at the American Birding Association convention in Oregon. And I know that the date was June 5th, right? 2006, because that's the day my son was born, and I had to race out of there, get on a plane, come back here, and it was stressful to say the least. And they hung up a sign, said, unfortunately, the speaker had to go, you know, back home because his son was being born. And I became kind of famous for the person who didn't give the talk for all the right reasons. So this is, there's a lot going on in this blackbird talk. This is the family tree of all the icterids, the blackbirds. And I won't go through all of this, just to sort of suffice to say that the main group in here are the blackbirds, grackles, cowbirds, and mainly blackbirds. And then there are some other branches like the caciques and oropendolas, icterus over here. The yellow birds are the orioles. So there's like the orioles are a group, the oropendolas and caciques are a group, the kind of classic blackbirds. And then there's this other group, which is kind of weird. It's the bobolink, yellow-headed blackbird, and the meadowlarks. So this sort of, you know, the bobolink and the meadowlarks kind of make sense, but the yellow-headed blackbird being with them, to think that a yellow-headed blackbird is more closely related to a bobolink or a meadowlark than it is to a red-winged blackbird is really kind of odd to me, but it shows up again and again. And it's a well-defined group, this set of icterids. It's just the sort of groups within the family are sort of interesting in that. So you see this flying bird here is a crested oropendola. So it fits in this group, and these are tropical and very, very different, cool birds in the family. Now, this talk is sort of a journey through America, you know, thinking of America as really the entire continent from North to South America. And it's a group, this set of birds that is found only in America. They're truly new world. And just a few vagrants have shown up in Europe and so forth. So they're different species all the way along. I got to replace this one probably with all of the different First Nations people that lived in the Americas. Instead, I sort of have the colonial powers originally, and it's just to point out that we kind of think of ourselves here in the U.S. as this stable country, kind of it's always been here, and it wasn't always here, and it's been changing all the while, and Canada has, and who had this land and all that land and so on. And there's an element of birds, and maybe my history, having been born way down in Chile. Actually, I'm part Mapuche First Nations right here, and then grown up in Canada, and then now living in California, and then having traveled a lot, that I kind of sometimes just think of it all as the same continent. Like I wish kind of it was, we're like the birds, and just felt like these borders were all a little bit, not really real. And so I'm trying to get that through these birds, to show you that the American continent is really quite amazing. And we're kind of all connected, not just by land, but by these birds and by our history of being lands that were colonized by Europeans, various different people from Europe and so forth. But we all share this kind of joint history. North America, we have forests, wetlands, we have all of this cool stuff going on, mountains. And we do have these classic North American blackbirds that are marsh nesting, like red-winged blackbird and yellow-headed blackbird that you probably all know. Yellow-headed's just got a great, crazy song. Actually, two different song types that they do. And these birds were studied early on in that they're unusual for most birds around here anyways, in that the male set up a territory, and then a female shows up and decides to join up with that male. And sometimes a second female or a third female can join up with that male in a polygynous situation. And they were one of the first birds that were studied in the thought of thinking, like, why does female number 2 join this situation where the male's attention and his territory is already taken partly by another female? And the idea is that this male might have control over land that is so valuable as in terms of food, of resources, that the second female says, you know what, I'm better off actually coming here to this really good set of this marsh, rather than going and mating singly with that other male that's in a poor part of the marsh. So some males that have control of the best land also have more mates. So it's all about the female choosing what's best for her energetic, intake, by being in a great, place for raising chicks. And that was called the polygyny threshold model that was written up way back by Gordon Orions, looking at these birds. There are also these amazing, beautiful group, birds that we know as the Orioles, and it could be, Hooded Oriole that you might have if you're a Californian in your backyard, that uses these Washingtonia fan palms. And it's so cool to me that they're so associated with these palms that their distribution has moved northward as people have planted the palm north of its natural range. Then they make this hanging cup-like, well, not cup-like, it's more like a basket nest made out of the palm little strings that they get from the palm. And there's a whole subset of Orioles that always do this. They actually nest in palms or associate with palms and make the nest out of palms. And that nest is a hanging kind of whitish yellow structure. And what's odd is somebody back in the day said, you know what, I think all these Orioles that do this are all related to each other. And they're a little skinnier and have thinner bills like the Hooded Oriole. And in fact, it's true. The genetics sort out that the ones that love palms and are skinnier with the skinnier bills and make these kinds of nests are all more closely related to each other. And they were given a subgenus, bananivorous, basically meaning liking bananas, which I don't know if they do. And then there are other Orioles that are in the more classic Oriole group, a little fatter, shorter tailed. And these two are well known. Well, I mean, the baseball people know the Baltimore Oriole, but for bird people, the Baltimore Oriole and the Bullock's Oriole are two very different looking birds that happen to hybridize where they meet, which seems odd. You would think like all of this investment you're in this cool looking plumage and it's not working. Why are you hybridizing? You obviously know you're not the same thing. Why is it going on? And it happens kind of in the Great Plains where the east meets the west, and Bullock's Oriole is a western bird, the Baltimore Oriole is an eastern bird. And they meet actually in an interesting situation where the moisture gradient in the environment changes rather quickly. So Bullock's Orioles are actually associated with dry habitats. Baltimore Orioles are associated with wet habitats. And in this part of North America, it's kind of right in between. And it's, if you look at the range, it's sort of right in here. And I was able to go to Oklahoma and Western Kansas and work on some of this with my supervisor, Jim Rising. And here's Jim. Jim passed away a few years ago. He was a super nice guy, also a birder, not just a biologist, but he was just an all-around naturalist, grew up as a bird watcher and became a biologist. And Jim Rising studied this hybridization. This is what a hybrid looks like. Actually, it's kind of a cool looking critter. And in the area of hybrids, that little zone that might be only about like 80 miles, from end to end, from any detection of any hybrid look, every bird is a hybrid. There are no pure birds. And what he realized is that if you were sort of looking at in a graph, like the morphology of Bullock's Orioles and the morphology of Baltimore Orioles, and they were different, right in that hybrid zone, it went like this. It was really steep, that difference. They changed very quickly. And he looked at this, stayed about the same width and didn't change too much. So he said, you know what, these things hybridize, but they don't share genes. If they were sharing genes, that middle area would start growing, it would change, and it wouldn't be so steep. And this step climb in morphology is now one of the reasons we sort of look at some birds that hybridize and say, in fact, they are different species, because even though they hybridize here, most of their gene pools are staying separate. And maybe in that little region where they hybridize for a reason, because one of them is a wet bird and one of them is a dry bird, and in the middle, you get a middle habitat. Therefore, the hybrids actually might do better just in that middle situation, not in the other situations where they live. So we've learned a lot from these birds over time. One of the birds that I want to point out that you might not think of as that unusual is one of the blackbirds, and it's a colonial blackbird. Now, colonies of birds are not rare, especially if you think about gulls, terns, things like, that SFPBO works on, mostly seabirds or non-passerines, but passerines or landbirds that are colonial are very rare, especially in the New World. One of the most common at one point and famous is the passenger pigeon. Colonial birds need the numbers. They're a numbers game kind of group, and they need big, wide areas of habitat where they can do this kind of thing. And it's no surprise that passenger pigeon went extinct. Well, our colonial bird is the tricolored blackbird. It is the only colonial land bird in North America, and the colonies are synchronized. They're non-territorial. They're totally different than red-winged blackbirds, that I just told you earlier. They stake out that territory, and the females, you can have the 2 or 3 nests of tricolored blackbirds on the same, twig. They're not colonial at all. And they need everything to be there, the breeding habitat, the foraging habitat, and they need it in good masses because they need numbers. The bigger the number of the colony, the higher the success rate is generally for, at least historically, for tricolored blackbirds, which is this one in the top here. This is a plate from our book too, on the blackbirds. And they have declined over time in a massive way, so much so that there used to be single colonies of tricolored blackbirds that are multiples of probably the remaining entire world population of tricolored blackbirds. There were, you know, colonies of tens of thousands, you know, of tricolored blackbirds. And that's not what occurs anymore. So when you think about the Central Valley and, you know, the fact that a lot of this was marshland in the past, just huge, one of the biggest marshes on Earth, and now it isn't, you start getting an idea for why these blackbirds have are so restricted. Here you can see flooded fields that are being used, you know, for agriculture a lot of times of the year. So this has been part of the issue with tricolored blackbirds. And we think of them as kind of like, oh, they're just kind of a little rarer version of the red-winged blackbird. They're completely different. And they synchronize in their colonies like you wouldn't believe. They you know, they will do everything at the same time. And that's, you know, to be able to have all the chicks out at the same time, the eggs at the same time, so predators are overwhelmed by their numbers. And here's a good tricolored blackbird. This is a female tricolored blackbird. They're actually quite dark. This is our local red wings that are called the bicolored blackbird because they don't have the edge on the epaulet. And what is weird is that bicolored blackbird females actually look like tricolored blackbird females. This is a kind of classic California blackbird female. She actually looks more like the tricolored blackbird female than she does to more typical red-winged blackbirds in other parts of the world. These are actually both taken in my backyard. And in the winter, I get both the more bright and stripy northern ones, probably from Oregon and British Columbia or somewhere, and then the local ones. So when you see them side by side, it's kind of striking how different they are. And they usually segregate to different flocks. They don't actually hang out together, which is all kind of interesting. So we go, you know, to the other part of the Americas and into the middle of the, well, actually not too far away from Kansas in there, and you have these meadowlarks. We have eastern and western meadowlarks. Unlike the Orioles, they actually overlap quite a bit. So western meadowlarks can get, you know, sometimes all the way out to Michigan, Minnesota and stuff, and right in the middle of eastern meadowlark distributions. I did want to play you some voices though here. I'm going to start with this eastern. These are the pictures of the voices, so you can see pitch on this side. So on the graph, a lower pitch sound will be here and a higher pitch sound will be here. So these look like whistles that decline. They're going down in pitch, right? And kind of simple whistles, quite different from Western Meadowlark here. Western Meadowlark kind of has all this funny popping around kind of stuff. But let me play you an Eastern Meadowlark, get an idea. Now here's a Western. Western Meadowlark is much lower pitched, and the notes are different too. What is cool is there's a desert, you know, Arizona all the way to western Texas form of the Eastern Meadowlark that has a similar looking song. If you look at the picture, I'm going to try to see if I can get it to go here because I suddenly lost my, okay, there we go. And this one's called Lilian's Meadowlark. It's got a nickname. It's a subspecies. It extends into Mexico. And although it kind of looks like a pale version of the Eastern, and the notes are kind of like an Eastern, it sounds a little bit like a Western because all of the notes are lower pitched. And this one's been proposed for a long time to maybe be a third kind of meadowlark that's in the US. Just now, like recently, April 2021, Joanna Bream published this amazing study on genetic and acoustic differences of Lilian's meadowlark that is so foolproof, airtight, that it's, I think, going to be separated as a brand new species for the US and Mexico. And it's a kind of an ID nightmare, but we always, you know, that's more stuff we can talk about at workshops. But other meadowlarks in the rest of the New World tend to be reddish on the underparts, quite unlike our northern meadowlarks. And there's even a subgroup within the meadowlarks, which are little short-tailed, big-leg things that sometimes are clumped in a different genus, Leistes, and they also have red. And this one here is in the same genus as our eastern and western, the long-tailed, and it's red too. It's kind of amazing when you are so used to seeing meadowlarks as yellow-breasted, and then you see all of these other species that are so, obviously meadowlarks, but they're red underneath. Here's pictures of really kind of one of the most outstanding of our North American blackbirds, the yellow-headed blackbird. The female on the right, they have these white wing patches, and they're big, and they have the yellow head. It's almost more like a saffron colored head. They have sort of orangey tips to them. But there are other species that look like them in South America, but are unrelated to them. In fact, these two, the yellow hooded blackbird from northern South America and the scarlet headed blackbird from southern South America, are each in their own two different groups within the family that are separate to the yellow headed, which, if you remember, actually is related to the bobolink and the meadowlarks. But it's amazing how there's been this convergence on look, and there's blackbirds in different groups either revert to a all black look, or they have a flash color, and that flash color is often on the head or on the shoulders, and it tends to be associated with yellow, red, or orange, and that sort of happens over and over again. And here are birds that are black but are shiny. Iridescence is another aspect of the icterids that comes up again and again and again. And iridescence is actually difficult to create in a feather because it is structures within the feather that, that create the iridescence. So there's like little microstructures that essentially bend the light towards blues and greens and so forth, and you get these looks. Gray-tailed grackle, common grackle. If you're ever looking for a common grackle and you have good light, the fact that the head is a different color than the body, that's one of the ways you really can separate a gray-tailed or a bow-tailed from a common grackle. In bad light, they kind of look all black, but Brewer's Blackbird's another one of these all dark birds. The Brewer's Blackbird is the rusty blackbird. Is in the breeding season an all black bird that looks kind of like a Brewer's without as much iridescence, yet in the non-breeding season, they truly do have a good name. They get all these rusty edges to the plumage. What is really, to me, amazing when you think about how different these two plumages look is that these birds don't actually molt into the black breeding plumage. What happens is all the rusty feather tips wear away during the winter. So they get blacker and blacker and blacker and blacker as the winter progresses. And then by springtime, they actually look like the bird on the left. But they are on a long-term decline. They're a blackbird associated with northern forest, ponds, muskeg, spruce woods. And people fear that at first it was acid rain or pollution might have been what has been driving them down, because they eat a lot of insects, aquatic insects. And perhaps it's also pollution down in the non-breeding areas in the Mississippi Delta and southern parts of the US, southeastern parts of the US. It's unclear exactly why they're declining. And if you think, boy, they're a blackbird, right? They're adaptable. Aren't they adaptable like all other blackbirds? They're actually quite specific to these moist habitats, quite unlike a lot of the other blackbirds, unlike a Brewer's, for example, that can do well in parking lots. Heading further south in our journey through the Americas, we get into Central America. Here's pictures from Guatemala of Volcán de Fuego, and I forget which, this is San Jose volcano, and Lake Atitlan. And when you go down there, you will see all sorts of icterids, blackbirds that are unique to that part of the world, but you'll also see a lot of wintering birds that are sort of the birds we tend to think of as our birds are down there, like, Orchard Oriole becomes very common, and warblers, a lot of our warblers go and winter down there. And there's this thought of like, yeah, there are birds, but are they? They actually spend more of their life down there than they spend up here breeding. There really are our birds, but they're their birds too. They're the birds of people from Guatemala, and they're the birds of people from Mexico as they travel through. And maybe the beauty of that connection, to think that maybe these two young women have an orchard oriole in their backyard that then goes and breeds in somebody else's backyard in Michigan. I mean, that is kind of cool to think that we may not share the same language or exact history, but we actually do share these amazing animals that travel between these parts of the world. And there's sort of a way to see the world that's a little different, you know, than how we kind of tend to see the world as compartmentalized into these units, right? These are kids at the Los Andes Reserve in Guatemala. This is actually a forest reserve that's associated with a coffee plantation, shade coffee plantation. It's amazing for birds. Shade coffee, we could do a whole talk about that. Actually is quite good for wintering birds and some of the native, you know, land birds like, you know, black-vented oriole, or some even rare ones like this bar-winged oriole, which is actually quite, you know, you don't see them very often. That's why the picture is so bad, but this is associated with another place that does ecotourism, coffee, and conservation. So it can kind of all go hand in hand. What is cool about Los Andes is they also have a wonderful school system. Not all of the coffee plantations are as great as Los Andes, but they actually make an effort to actually treat people well, and you can see it when you go there. In any case, Orioles, you know, we're kind of talking about these Central American Orioles, and one of the things that about Orioles in general, and the northern ones, the ones that migrate like Bullocks or Hooded, are that, you know, you have these more, you know, classic orange and black and, you know, what have you, plumages in the adult males, duller plumages in the females and immatures. But then there's often like a spring first year male plumage. And that is interesting to think about as well. Why don't all birds hold off in maturation? Why do some birds do it? And why are some birds like showing a difference between the male and the female, right, in the plumage, like these bullocks or hooded? And then why is it that most of the time the female is duller in coloration than the male? Well, you can actually get at some of these questions if you study Orioles. I'll actually point out too that this plate is in the National Geographic Guide, and that's my good friend Peter Burke. So I've known him since I was a teenager, and he's the person that illustrated all of these amazing images that we used in our Blackbird book, which is out of print at this point in time. But look at all these Orioles. These are all Central American Orioles. Down here we have spot-breasted Altamira Oriole and streak-backed Oriole up here. This is a streak-backed Oriole. And you know what the cool thing about looking at all of these crazy images is that over here, this Altamira Oriole, which gets into Texas, you don't need to put a different picture for the male and the female. Both the male and female are bright. Same with the spot-breasted Oriole. Males and females look exactly the same. And they're unlike a song sparrow, right? A song sparrow, the male and the female looks the same, but they're dull in color. In Orioles, the males and females look the same, but they're bright. And streak-backed Oriole is kind of the cool one because in the south of the range, the males and females look alike. And in the northern part of the range, the female is distinctly duller than the male. So within one species, we have the entire situation. And then you have to ask, why do females get bright? It turns out that if you are resident and an Oriole, the female is bright because she helps in all of the territorial defense and so forth. And she is, you know, has sort of almost the same role as the male in territorial defense, while migratory Orioles don't do that. The male sets up territory early, they divide the roles in a sense, and then they switch in plumage type over, you know, as this happens. All right, Central America, one of the things you start seeing from Mexico on downwards are caciques and oropendolas. And oropendolas are, and you get to see a Montezuma Oropendola up close, and the cheek patches are actually bare skin, and they can change color slightly, and they have a pink one and a blue one and these huge bills. And we don't have that many chestnut birds up here, you know, in the US. They do these displays where they'll hang upside down and do all these crazy songs. It's just intense, and you get to see them in places that are amazing, like Tikal in Guatemala, or, you know, Chanchich in Belize. And they make these huge, long hanging nests that they clump in a group, right? And so they're like Orioles, but like they're like huge Orioles making huge. And then these clump nests have, there's all sorts of stuff going on here that I could get to. You know, there's probably a whole talk that can be done on this, but the ones that do best are the ones that really clump tightly, and the ones that don't do as well are the ones that are kind of loose out there. And this is because squirrels can get them, monkeys and all that. They sort of get protection from being together, usually in a single tree that's in a really obvious place, so that they're not in the middle of the forest. They actually want to be in an obvious separate tree, because that reduces predators, and also clump together. And the females choose to clump together for safety and, you know, being able to hatch more young out of the nests. And as soon as the females sort of, in a sense, did that, what happened is the evolutionary game started, where males started becoming bigger and bigger and bigger and trying to defend the entire colony against other males. And then you get a situation where sometimes one male will have access to mating with all of these females in one colony, and he's huge. And in fact, it's the biggest difference in body size of any bird on Earth are these oropendolas. And there's some other blackbirds that do something similar. And now this might sound similar to you because it's similar to what happens in elephant seals or red deer, where the females clump together, whether it be a beach or a herd, and then the males become really big and kind of dominate that whole thing. It's called harem defense polygyny. And harem defense polygyny is relatively widespread in mammals, but it's super rare in birds. In fact, it only happens in icterids, in blackbirds. They're the only birds that have this kind of mammalian type breeding system where they defend a clumping group of females. And others that do it are great-tailed grackle and bow-tailed grackle. And again, there's been this selection for high competition between males, often a lot of displaying. So rather than having crazy, you know, red deer antlers, they have these tails and the songs and all this type of stuff. But they're much bigger than the females, much, much bigger. So completely the opposite of the phalarope world are the grackles and oropendolas. A little bit about song. You probably heard red-winged blackbirds. If you're Californian and you heard that, you're like thinking, wow, that doesn't quite sound like ours. It actually is, because it's an Eastern one. Even though I have a picture of a California redwing, it's an Eastern song, which sounds more liquidy. But then some of the Orioles have these, crazy whistled songs. That's just like a guy walking down the forest whistling to himself. It's actually this yellow-backed Oriole, and they will, the males and females look alike, and in some populations, the males and females sing to each other in a duet, and they actually will mimic other species and do all sorts of cool things. Now, this picture is a spectrogram of a bird, a blackbird, and it has the highest frequency range of any bird in North America. It goes from the lowest of the low, we're talking grouse level, owl level low, to things beyond what humans can hear up here. And maybe the picture gives it away, probably not, but I'll play it for you. Maybe this will give you an idea what it is. It's not the most beautiful song, but in a sense, it's one of the most impressive songs of all of North American birds. And it's the brown-headed cowbird, which you don't think of as a crazy, skilled songster, but then you slow this down a bit and you get the sense for what's going on here. Isn't that weird? It starts with these really low popping things and then goes way up high to things that we cannot hear anymore. The most range of any bird in North America. I don't know if there's anybody else in the rest of the world that can do that. But I mentioned mimicry. Epaulet orioles in South America, they will actually mimic, but they only mimic things that are kind of dangerous, like hawks and kind of predatory critters. And it's thought that they do this just like RJs do, maybe to scare away some competitor birds from nearby, but they will only mimic that type of thing other than, you know, they don't mimic in the song like a mockingbird, for example. All right, let's go to the Caribbean. The Caribbean is unique because these islands hold populations of birds, mammals, insects that are extinct in the rest of the Americas. They really are a trove of living fossils. And in many cases, like if we look at trogons and we look at the Cuban trogon or Hispaniolan trogon, the oldest lineages of any New World trogon are the ones in the Caribbean. The toadies used to be widespread in the New World and even in Europe. They've gone extinct everywhere else except the Caribbean. It goes on and on and on like that. And even these mammals like Solenodon is this thing that has no close relatives living still other than some funky little mammals in Africa, and they're in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean holds all of these old lineages and even some families that are found nowhere else, like the palmchat. There are now other families that have been separated that are only found in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean is special, and it divides up as the Greater Antilles and then the Lesser Antilles down here. Starting, you know, classic images, the Caribbean has the beautiful beaches, but also there's a lot of rocky islands and some places that are really full of forest and are really quite wild. It's not all beaches and mai tais, you know. There's also some problems in these islands of birds that have become quite rare over time, like, you know, this yellow-shouldered blackbird, which is a relative of the redwing, that is in Puerto Rico, and their populations are really, really tiny. And you can see there's a band on this bird. They're being studied really closely to try to keep them from going extinct. There are also birds, Jamaica is a place I've never been to, but these two birds are Jamaican, the Jamaican blackbird and the Jamaican oriole, that are called the pine sergeant over there and the Auntie-Katy. So Auntie-Katy, because the oriole seems to sing out a song that suggests it's saying Auntie-Katy. And this is the only oriole that has any real green, that green color to it anywhere in the world. And then the pine sergeant is really the oldest, weirdest offshoot of the entire blackbird, the main blackbird group. So although it doesn't look like much, it's actually kind of a living relic. It might be sort of the proto-blackbird, what blackbirds were like before cowbirds and everything else kind of came about. So I want to see that one day. And, you know, it's beautiful places to bird in. But I want to look at these Lesser Antilles for a little bit and show you something about the Lesser Antilles. All these islands that are red and yellow are volcanic, and all the Antilles, Lesser Antilles that are on the outside are actually sedimentary. So you might have heard of the volcano on St. Vincent. There's also, the last big eruption was on Montserrat over here. And Guadeloupe is the only island that actually is made up of the two different histories. It has a volcanic side and a non-volcanic side. But these islands are kind of like, you know, little each one has different set of species, and going from one to the other, you see a lot of kind of evolution at work, you know, whether it's these different, you know, Martinique yellow warblers have red heads, while the ones next door in Guadeloupe don't. And, you know, I've shown you also one from the Galapagos, because it kind of starts making you think like the Lesser Antilles and the Galapagos have a lot going on that it's similar in their, you know, the evolution of these brand new species. And here's our volcano on Montserrat that I saw actually doing a pyroclastic flow once, which was pretty cool. Got to say, that was a highlight. And this beautiful bird that survived, even though half of the forest was destroyed by the volcano, the Montserrat Oriole is actually done quite well because people have stepped in to help it, you know, and it's probably what we'll have to do for the birds of St. Vincent. Like this is the St. Vincent parrot down below here, where the current situation's going on with the volcano. And I'll show you this other cool Oriole from a little farther north in Martinique that has almost like a wine-colored head. But the Vinci, the people of St. Vincent call the parrot the Vinci. It's also not only rare, endangered, and now even more so, it's a bird they say also has all of the colors of their flag. So it's a very important bird to the people. And hopefully when the volcano kind of settles down, we can see what can be done for the birds there. But when I traveled through the Lesser Antilles, I was also, you know, people might be looking at these parrots and all these fancy birds. I was looking at all these blackbirds that everybody ignored because they were pecking around, you know, at the tables in the restaurants, carob grackles. And carob grackles, the males all look the same, but depending on what island you go to, the females look totally different. So these are females of the same species, one from Martinique, St. Vincent, or Barbados, and you'll see that they look different. But the males actually match. Their song types differ on islands where the females differ. And I think there's actually multiple species of carob grackles, and I've thought of, you know, I've recorded them all. So one day, you know, my friend calls these the break a leg projects, like when your leg is broken or something happens and you got to sit at home for a while. These are the things that you'll get done. So I haven't broken my leg yet. And in the Lesser Antilles also, you get to see this plethora of different, I assure you, these are not, A, they're not all house wrens, and B, they're not all the same species. So there's more work to be done. And I'll just point out that this St. Vincent house wren, this cute looking thing, if you look at all the literature that's come out post the volcano, nobody mentions the house wren. Nobody mentions the house wren because it's not a species. It's a subspecies, but I tell you that probably deserves to be thought of, and maybe this is not going to be good news for the St. Vincent house wren. Two of the house wrens have gone extinct over, you know, in the last 100 years. So keep that in mind. Then you know, America, it's been to the Caribbean. You have, well, you know, the lowland forests, the Amazon. South America, when you start looking at its history, it was an island. It was like Australia for a long time, and then eventually joined up with North America. And a lot of things that we think of as uniquely New World evolved in the island of South America when it was separate, including probably blackbirds and you know, tanagers, a lot of things that we sort of think of as truly New World. But here's some examples of some of the cool oropendolas you can see in the tropics, olive and russet-backed oropendolas. They have those chestnut colors. I really love them because we don't see that many chestnuts, and also the moss color, that mossy green on the olive oropendola. I mean, if you're a bird painter in the US or Canada, you never have to bring that color out because it just doesn't happen. And then these fancy yellow and black caciques, there's a lot going on in the cacique world in terms of their nesting. They're like oropendolas, they clump their nests usually. Some of them not so much, like this yellow-winged cacique here with a crazy headdress is Mexican, and they're a little bit more solitary. Heading to the Andes, one of the species that people always ask me, oh, if you wanted to, you know, of all the birds in the world, what's one that you really want to see? red-bellied grackle. I've never seen a red-bellied grackle. It's not a grackle, it's in its own genus. It's a fancy looking bird, a blackbird that has a funny shape, and the red isn't up on the top. The red's actually in the legs and vent and belly. So I'd love to see this. And I have a friend that has them coming to his backyard, so it's not that hard. I picked something that's not that difficult. Just have to get to the right spot in Colombia. Probably the bird that gave rise to all of the caciques and oropendolas likely looks like this, like a yellow-billed cacique, as it's one of the older lineages in that group. And, you know, as you venture down further south in South America, a lot of places become more open, like the Pantanal or the Llanos, and these open marshy areas have blackbirds associated with them. And again, it starts mirroring the marsh situations of the north. And I'll show you some of these marsh birds in a bit. Troupial is a Oriole, but this one over here, the chestnut-capped blackbird, in good light, this head looks kind of reddish, a weird kind of reddish. And the local people in Uruguay, for example, call them the Garibaldino, named for the redcoats of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was an Italian that, well, he had this army of volunteer army of people in Italy that, you know, there's a whole history, look them up, but they wore these red coats, and they actually were sent to Uruguay during the Civil War. So the local people knew the red coat, and then one of the blackbirds got the name Garibaldino from Garibaldi. Now this is the country I was born in. This is Chile. This is Torres del Paine. One of the reasons I wrote The Birds of Chile is because I spent a lot of time birding there as I got to know my country after being away for a long time. And it's a beautiful place. I got to say that I've been to a bunch of places over time, and it still ranks as one of the prettiest countries to go birding in. This is the Altiplano. This is the volcano not too far away from where my parents were born, and in what they call the south of Chile, but it's really not the south. It's sort of the temperate rainforest part of Chile. Let's hear more pictures of the far south. And this is the land where you can see the southernmost blackbird in the world, the Austral Blackbird. And then this is the southernmost parrot in the world, the Austral parakeet. So Austral actually means southern. It's the opposite of boreal. So the Austral Blackbird, this all black bird with this pointy bill, its closest relative is that red-headed bird I showed you earlier, the scarlet hooded blackbird. So the images of the pampas, what you would see there, and all these amazing marshes where you might see the marsh bird. This is a yellow-rump marsh bird, a kind of blackbird. There's two species of marsh birds, and it's also the kind of place where you might encounter the local cowboys, the gauchos. And gauchos have a real interest in nature. And if you're watching birds, you can always chat to a gaucho, ask them what they've been seeing, and you could spend hours talking to the gauchos because that's all they see is nature, and they're really interested in it. But the parallels of the birds down there, it's interesting. These scarlet-hooded blackbirds and versus, yellow-headed or red-winged blackbird. Here are two more pictures of southern species. Instead of a red-winged blackbird, this is a yellow-winged blackbird, and it's different from the yellow-shouldered blackbird I showed you earlier. These marsh nesting blackbirds are found in lesser densities than North American ones. And the food, the production in these marshes is lower than North American marshes. North American marshes tend to produce a lot of little damselflies. That's a main food of a lot of our yellow-headed blackbirds, for example. The same thing doesn't happen in the south. So less dense, and also there's almost no polygyny at all. In fact, these scarlet-hooded, blackbirds stay together year-round as a pair. The male and the female look alike, so quite different from our northern birds. Bobolinks, the most migratory of all the blackbirds, and here's a point. It is one of the only two birds in North America that molts all of its feathers completely, so complete molt twice in the year. The other one is also a long distance migrant that nests in in the north. It's not a blackbird. I won't tell you what it is unless you ask me later. And there are conservation issues with some of these birds in the south. The saffron-cowled blackbird is actually quite rare, this beautiful yellow and black bird, and it needs old growth type grassland. You can't have them in grasslands that are being overgrazed. It needs this tall, older stuff, often associated with water. But the cool thing is, it's one of the most amazing things that you'll ever see is that saffron-cowled blackbird and this black and white monjita, which is a kind of flycatcher, they hunt together. Little flocks of blackbirds are on the ground in these marshes, and they scare up the bugs. And the monjitas eat the bugs that they scare up as they walk around. And then the monjitas tell the blackbirds when trouble's coming. But they will hunt together, two completely unrelated groups of birds. And I'll end with brood parasites, which I know some of you dislike cowbirds, but I gotta tell you, I'm one of the biggest fans of cowbirds there is. And I'll tell you one cowbird story here. And this is a shiny cowbird here with a rufous-collared sparrow, but there are multiple species of cowbirds in the Americas. You might know of the bronze cowbird on the left, you know the brown-headed cowbird. Maybe you've heard of shiny cowbird, which is the one at the bottom. And if you put together the relationship of cowbirds, it kind of blows up the myth that cowbirds and brood parasitism evolved because the cowbirds were following the bison and they couldn't hang out in any one place. Therefore, this system of nesting, with hosts that would just take care of your eggs evolved. By the time cowbirds got to North America, right, the brown-headed cowbird, and met a bison, they already were cowbirds because the cowbirds evolved in South America without bison and they were already brood parasites. So they actually started parasitizing, the giant cowbird parasitizes oropendolas and caciques. So they started parasitizing their own. And that is something I'll tell you about in a bit. Here's a giant cowbird. Giant cowbirds were studied by this guy, Neil Smith, who also studied Thayer skulls way in the back and before. And I'll tell you the basic part of this story is that he published amazing stuff about Thayer skulls, and he published some amazing, incredulous, award-winning type work on giant cowbirds. And now people think all of it was made up. He might be one of the biggest fraudsters that ever was in the science world. And when people tried to redo or reassess any of the stuff he's done, none of it was possible. So I'll just leave you with that. All right. So High Fidelity. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie High Fidelity with the crazy Jack Black character and the old record store and what have you. And he's kind of a snarky comments at the people, who are buying records. Well, I kind of was like this Jack Black character at a bookstore. And it was this bookstore that was pretty amazing. While I was a student, I was hired because the bookstore only sold birds and nature books and travel books. Two of the things that travel and birds. I love it. And it was this crazy place. This is actually Jeff, the guy that owned the store. It's not there anymore. But this is the kind of store it was. It was kind of like the book version of the movie with the records. And I would sit there and try to help people, choose the right bird book. People would come in and say, oh, I need a map to Bali. And I try to find the map. Or, oh, I'm going to go birding in Colombia. What's the best bird book? And I would rummage through. And it was one of those things where I knew exactly where everything was in this mess. But often when I was working there, there was nothing to do. There was nobody around. And I would just read books. And I found this guy. William Henry, sometimes known as Guillermo Hudson, grew up in Argentina. As a kid, he was a naturalist in Argentina. He wrote this beautiful, actually, set of books, The Naturalist in La Plata. And then later, he was an American, actually, his American family. He moved to England. And in England, he became famous as an author. He wrote some well-known books that are still, some people say some of the best writing that mixes both kind of ecological thought and sort of romanticism all together. Green Mansions is one of the books he's really known for, but he also wrote these books just on birds and nature. He's kind of a hero in Argentina down there. And I'm reading Naturalist in La Plata, and I encounter the fact that he talks about these cowbirds, and he says there's two cowbirds, they're very much alike, but they act completely different. And one of them is the shiny cowbird, and the other one is the screaming cowbird over here. And the screaming is a little bit less, shiny, and it's got a little longer wings, thicker bill. There's some other differences, but he also said the shiny cowbird will put its eggs in the nests of multiple species, sparrows, anything, just like our brown-headed cow. But he said the screaming cowbird is a specialist. It only parasitizes this other blackbird. So it only has one host, and it's this bird called the baywing. Now the baywing used to be called the baywing cowbird because it was thought to be a cowbird that didn't perform any brood parasitism. In fact, it kind of is the shape of a cowbird, but it's a different group of blackbirds. So I actually suggested we just call it the baywing, and now it's called grayish baywing is the official name of this bird. It used to be the baywing cowbird. But this is the host that takes care of the young of the brood parasitic screaming cowbird. Now look how different they are, right? The screaming is black all over. It has a little rusty on the underwing. The baywing has a dark mask, grayish, and these beautiful kind of tawny wings. And what is weird is that the screaming cowbirds only use this host. The males and females have to cooperate to get access to the nests because the baywings are really, really protective of the nest. And the baywings show no sign of when they're going to actually start nesting. They try to trick the cowbirds by sort of saying, oh, we're going to start nesting now. And then they let the cowbirds put in a lot of eggs in the nests, and then they clean them all out. And then eventually they will lay their own eggs. So it's kind of this almost like an arms race between these two species, the cowbird trying to get in there and into its one host, and the host creating different diversions and ways to avoid being parasitized. Now, here's where, like, anytime I talk about this, I get goosebumps because you see, I showed you pictures of the baywings right in here, right? And that's a young baywing. Here's a screaming cowbird. Here's actually me banding a screaming cowbird. And that bird there that looks just like the baywing, that's the juvenile screaming cowbird. It is the most amazing mimicry you will ever see on Earth. These two birds are not related to each other. In fact, this bird here is, although it looks like a baywing, it could be, it might not be. I can't quite tell. I think it might be a young baywing because the juvenile screamings look just like baywings. They sound like baywings. All of their vocalizations are like baywings in the nest, all their behavior. And then when they fledge, they quickly turn black. And when they turn black, they switch all of their vocalizations. Everything about them switches, and they become the screaming cowbird. But it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen live. Thanks to William Henry Hudson, I got to study this for my master's. Here are pictures of the two, just to give you an idea of how similar they are. That's a juvenile screaming cowbird, that's a juvenile baywing. And here this author's pointing out that the baywing's got a little darker on the face, and if you look at the underwings, the baywing's got pale underwings and the screaming has dark underwings. But if you see them in the field, you can't see that. I, in fact, realized when I was looking at them that the nostril is a little rounder and more obvious, and that was the most reliable way to separate the two kinds of birds when I had them in the nest, because I was banding them and trying to sort them out and so forth. Amazing, just incredible. So hopefully I've convinced you that we live on the most amazing continent in the world, and that these birds that maybe you've learned to ignore over time because they're common, like these, Brewer's blackbirds, are some of the coolest birds on Earth. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Alvaro. That was so interesting. I learned so much. And I'm always so impressed by the depth of knowledge you have on pretty much any bird topic. So thank you so much. So Alvaro, the first question, we had a couple of people with similar questions, but essentially, what makes a blackbird a blackbird? So of course you mentioned the genetics, of course, is a major part of it, but are there any characteristics that they tend to share?
I would say that the long, generally long pointed bills that are really kind of parallel, not parallel sided, but straight sided, they tend to be robust birds, even if they're smallish. They've got good thick legs. And then this ability to open the bill at, I guess it's the adductor muscles are well developed. And then the tendency to either be black or have yellow, red, and orange. So it's a funny, it's weird. It's sort of like once you get to know them, they're easier to define, but I would find warblers are kind of harder to define than blackbirds in some ways, because there's a lot of little birds that have yellow and green in them all over the world, but these guys are a little bit more, restricted in their look.
And then earlier you were talking about the yellow-headed blackbirds and how they're colonial. So Margot asked, what do you mean by colonial in this case?
Oh, colonial means that you're well, here's the thing, like, you can say, that's a colony of red-winged blackbirds, because they're in a certain part of the marsh and so forth. But in fact, they're not. Colonial birds have to be non-territorial, right? They have to be nesting in a denser situation than sort of the norm. And they're all together, and they usually often will synchronize their nesting so that they can, by doing everything at the same time, all the chicks being out at the same time, predators have so many to choose from that you decrease the chance that your kid is going to be eaten by the falcon or what have you. So I would say that tricolored blackbirds are truly colonial, but a red-winged blackbird group are not. They're actually just an aggregation of nesting birds because of habitat. But they have to be, to me, non-territorial and clumped densely. So that's what passenger pigeons did. That's what some African weaver birds do, and what our tricolored blackbirds do. And it's really different from most land birds.
Well, thanks for that clarification. And John asked, what do you know about ultraviolet colors in blackbirds?
I don't actually. That's kind of a new thing that to look at other, but I bet it's some major stuff's going on. If you're working so hard to create these iridescent plumages, maybe other, there's more going on that we're not seeing. So I would say it's worthy of somebody putting them under a black light or whatever you do to figure that out.
Yeah, it'd be cool to see if they're showing more colors than we can possibly imagine.
One thing though that it makes me think of, there's some of these amelanic, or you could call them leucistic, red-winged blackbirds that show up every so often, where they'll have no melanin in a certain part of the head and so forth. A lot of orange shows through in the head of red-winged blackbirds. It seems like they actually have orange underneath the black, like hidden away by the black. The only way that you see it is by removing the melanin, but it's genetically there, and it's actually there if you have a leucistic bird. So you wonder if they can see some of that, or if it's actually visibly there. It's always a question I've had, but you can see it in those oddball birds.
Oh, that's super interesting. And then Dina asked, do you know if the yellow-breasted chat is being reevaluated and potentially placed in with the blackbirds?
Actually, that's a really good question for a couple of reasons, because the yellow-breasted chat, everybody always said, well, it's a warbler, but it doesn't really act, sound, or do anything like a warbler, but it's a warbler. And now the genetics have sorted out that it isn't a New World warbler. It's like a different line of birds that has no close, well, relatively close relatives, but it's kind of all on its own. So the resolution that so far is that they're going to give it its own family. So it's going to be a single species family. And I think that might be officially what's happening now. But if you know the scientific names and how it works, it's called Icteria virens because it's yellow. Icterus are where the Icteridae come from, which are Orioles, but this is Icteria. So if you create the family name based on the genus that exists, it becomes Icteridae, which is already taken. So the resolution to that, because there's certain rules in the naming, is that it's going to be Icteridae with 2 eyes. And then Icteridae with 1 eye. Now, talk about confusing. So if you see the Icteridae with 2 eyes, that's the chat. Icteridae with 1 eye, that's the blackbirds.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to wait and see what they are doing with it.
Yeah, I think that's what's going on now, but you know.
Cool. And then let's see. So Carol, thanks for asking the question. What is the other bird that does the 2 complete molts?
All right, Franklin's gull. Franklin's gull is the other one that molts completely twice. So, and it's also a long distance migrant, and that's probably the answer why a bobolink or Franklin's gull has to do this twice. They just need to replace all of those feathers because of the long migrations, and they're also out in the open habitats rather than being in forested habitats.
Wow, that is
Thanks for asking.
Very different from what I would have guessed.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's see. And then Jim asked, have you done or do you plan to do any birding tours to the Lesser Antilles?
Oh boy, I'd like to return there. It's beautiful, it's interesting, but it's logistically kind of a nightmare. So I have to find the right partner to help me with the logistics. So you have to fly between all of those little islands and nothing's on time. And, you know, it's all island time. So it's island time multiplied by 15 islands or 10 islands, depending on how many you want to go to. But I have often wanted to go back there. Yes, yes. So it's kind of in there in my head. See if we could do it somehow.
All right, stay tuned for that. And then Clay asked, are the bullocks in Baltimore hybrids, are they fertile?
Yeah, yeah, fully 100%. But those genes don't leave that hybrid zone. They just don't do well outside of the hybrid zone. So that maintains the 2 gene pools separate. So they're selected against outside of the hybrid zone and probably not selected against within the hybrid zone. So.
Wow, really interesting. Okay, so that is the last question I'm seeing so far, but if anybody has any last minute ones they want to add in there, go ahead and do that. But Alvaro, is there anything else that you want to share with everyone before we, sign off potentially?
No, please check out alvarosadventures.com for bird trips or workshops. We have seabird workshops next month, and also pelagic trips starting, going to the Farallon Islands starting in June, July. So that's always fun.
All right, yeah, I'm sure it'll be great to get back out there. So again, thank you so much for this fantastic presentation, and thank you to everybody for attending.